I had 60 seconds before the silver tray left my hand, and the lead hit his heart. My fingers gripped the leather edge of the wine list so hard the stitching threatened to pop, my palms slick with a sweat that had nothing to do with the humid London summer outside. The menu felt like a heavy stone, a weight I was about to drop into the middle of a shark tank. Around me, the restaurant hummed with the curated symphony of the 1%. The melodic chime of crystal, the low thrum of a cello from the corner, and the soft, rhythmic scrape of steak knives against fine-bone china. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the shard loomed over the city like a jagged obsidian needle. But inside, under the warm glow of the chandeliers, the air was thick, cloying and suffocating. I walked toward the center booth like a woman marching toward a firing squad. Seo Min-Tae sat with his profile in the room, looking like a king carved from shadow. Sharp jaw, immaculate black hair, and a suit that cost more than my father's house. His eyes were fixed on the wine list, appearing thoughtful, perhaps even bored, while his fingers traced a slow, rhythmic pattern on the tablecloth. Beside him, Rosa R. Ferguson sat draped in silk, her eyes never leaving her phone, her expression a mask of elegant indifference. She looked like a woman who had spent her life being served. She wasn't. She was a woman waiting for a slaughter. 12 minutes ago, in the sterile, soundproof silence of the walk-in pantry, I'd heard her cold, clipped voice through a crack in the door. She wasn't ordering dessert. She was confirming the coordinates for the hit. I had been sent to find a vintage Malbec. Instead, I'd found the expiration date for the man sitting at table 4. The rim of the crystal glass was a hair's breadth from Seo Min-Tae's lips when I moved. I didn't hesitate. I leaned down, bringing my face inches from his, mimicking the posture of a diligent server describing a vintage. "Don't drink," I breathed, the words barely a vibration against the air. "The wine is spiked. The woman to your left has a silenced Glock in her clutch, and the exits are already blocked. Move now or die here." For a heartbeat, time suspended. Min-Tae's dark eyes flicked to mine, sharp and freezing, searching for a lie he wouldn't find. He didn't blink. He didn't even look at Rosa. Across from him, Rosa's composure shattered. Her thumb hammered the screen of her phone, and she began to reach into her silk bag. "Now," I hissed. Min-Tae acted with the speed of a sprung trap. With one explosive motion, he surged upward, his massive hand catching the edge of the heavy oak table and flipping it. Crystal shattered, the poisoned Malbec splattering across Rosa's white silk like a fresh wound. The muffled thwip-thwip of silence rounds hissed through the air exactly where Min-Tae's chest had been a second before. Screams erupted from the nearby tables as the high-end serenity of the restaurant was replaced by the cold reality of a hit. "Down!" Min-Tae roared, his hand slamming onto my shoulder and forcing me toward the floor as a second volley of shots blew out the decorative chandeliers above us. The room plunged into a terrifying amber twilight, lit only by the flickering candles and the emergency strobes. I could see the shadows of men in tactical gear moving through the main entrance, their silhouettes blocking the light from the lobby. "They have the front and the elevators." I yelled over the ringing in my ears. I grabbed the sleeve of his expensive suit, my fingers locking onto the fabric. "Follow me. There's a service corridor behind the wine cellar. It's a blind spot for the security cameras." Min-Tae didn't argue. He drew a sleek, black handgun from a holster I hadn't seen, his expression a mask of lethal focus. "Lead the way, little bird. If this is a trap, you're the first one I kill." I didn't have time to be afraid of his threat. I stayed low, crawling through the wreckage of broken porcelain and spilled steak, leading him toward the heavy velvet curtains that masked the staff entrance. I knew this floor plan better than my own home. I knew which floorboards creaked and which corners stayed dark. Behind us, Rosa was screaming orders, her voice no longer elegant, but shrill and desperate. We burst through the double doors into the industrial glare of the kitchen. The chefs had already fled, leaving pans smoking on the ranges. The freight lift is too slow. I panted, pointing toward a narrow, nondescript door used for laundry. The trash chute leads to the sub-basement. It's a straight shot to the alley where the delivery trucks park. They won't be looking for a king in the garbage. Min-Tae looked at the small door, then back at the kitchen entrance where the hitmen were appearing. He gave a grim, predatory smile. Effective. Let's go. The trash chute was a jarring, claustrophobic slide into the bowels of the city. We emerged into the sub-basement amidst the stench of wet cardboard and industrial cleaner, but there was no time to breathe. Min-Tae moved like a shadow, his hand a constant, grounding pressure on my arm as he steered me through the labyrinth of the service tunnels and out into the biting London night. A matte black SUV was idling in the mouth of the alley, its headlights cut. We were inside and moving before the door had even fully latched. The transition from the chaos of the restaurant to the interior of the car was eerie. The vehicle was a vault on wheels, silent, armored, and smelling of cold leather and gun oil. Min-Tae didn't speak. He stared out the tinted window, his jaw tight, watching the neon lights of the city blur into streaks of electric blue and red. I sat beside him, my waitress uniform torn at the shoulder, my breath coming in shallow hitches. My life, the one with nursing exams and double shifts, felt like it had belonged to someone else. A girl who had died the moment I leaned down to whisper that warning. 20 minutes later, the city gave way to the secluded, industrial edges of the river. We pulled up to a monolithic structure of raw concrete and reinforced glass that loomed against the fog like a brutalist fortress. There were no gardens here, no welcoming lights. Only high walls topped with coiled wire and the silent, watchful eyes of security cameras. As the heavy steel gates groaned shut behind us, the finality of it hit me. "Get out," Min-Tae said, his voice low and gravelly. I followed him into the heart of the sanctuary. The interior was as cold as the man who owned it. The floors were polished gray stone, and the furniture was all sharp angles and obsidian metal. It wasn't a home. It was a command center. Guards in dark suits stood at every threshold, their faces as expressionless as the concrete walls. Min-Tae stopped in the center of the vast, open living area and finally turned to look at me. In the harsh, recessed lighting, the blood on his cuff looked black. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a touch that was surprisingly light, yet possessed the terrifying weight of ownership. "You saved my life, Kemi Ajayi," he said, the syllables of my name sounding strange and heavy in his accent. "But you should have stayed in the pantry. By speaking, you've crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. You aren't just a witness anymore. You're a player in a war you don't understand." I looked around the sterile, reinforced room, realizing that this sanctuary was also a cage. The gravity of my choice settled into my marrow. I hadn't just saved a man. I had entered a world where mercy was a weakness and survival was the only currency that mattered. I wasn't just Kemi from the Gilded Lotus anymore. I was a casualty of the underworld, and the war was only just beginning. The sun had not yet risen when the SUV dropped me at the mouth of my street. Min-Tae had protested, his eyes dark with a warning that I was no longer safe, but the need to see my brother, Tund, was a physical ache in my chest. I needed to know that the nightmare at the restaurant hadn't bled into our cramped, quiet flat. I needed to see him asleep, surrounded by his textbooks, to believe that my world hadn't completely tilted off its axis. I hurried down the rain-slicked pavement, my waitress heels clicking rhythmically against the concrete like a countdown. The hallway of our building smelled of stale cooking and damp, a familiar scent that usually brought me comfort. Now it felt like a thin veil between me and a precipice. My hand trembled as I slid the key into the lock. "Tund." I called out, my voice cracking. "Tund, I'm home. I'm sorry I'm late." Silence met me. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a sleeping teenager. It was a heavy, hollow quiet that made the hair on my arms stand up. I pushed open his bedroom door. The bed was unmade, the sheets tossed aside as if he'd been pulled out in a hurry. His laptop was still open, the screen glowing a ghostly blue, but his phone, the one thing he never left without, was lying face down on his desk. Panic, cold and sharp as an ice pick, pierced my heart. I spun around, my breath coming in jagged gasps, and ran to my own room. The light from the street lamp outside filtered through the blinds, casting long, cage-like shadows across the walls. Everything looked untouched until I saw it. There, lying in the center of my white pillow, was a single red rose. It was a beautiful, cruel thing. Its petals were a deep, oxygenated red, and the scent was overwhelming, filling the small room with the same cloying floral perfume Rosa had been wearing at the table. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the bloom. I didn't need to pick it up to know what it meant. This wasn't a gift. It was a signature. A blood-red promise. Rosa hadn't just tried to kill Min-Tae. She had been prepared for me too. She had known that even if the hit failed, she could reach into my life and pluck out the only thing that mattered. Tund was gone because I had chosen to find my voice. I collapsed onto the floor, the weight of the rose's meaning crushing the air from my lungs. I had tried to play the hero, to be the observer who finally stepped in, but in the world of monsters, every act of mercy has a price. My brother was the currency Rosa was using to buy back the power I'd stripped from her. As I sat in the dark, the scent of the rose suffocating me, I realized Min-Tae was right. The line was gone. I couldn't go back to being Kemi the waitress. To save my brother, I would have to become something else entirely. I would have to go back to the concrete fortress and ask the monster for help. I returned to the concrete fortress not as a guest, but as a ghost seeking a master. When the heavy gates locked behind me this time, the sound didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a vow. Min-Tae was in the central monitoring room, a space bathed in the blue, flickering light of a dozen screens. He didn't look at me when I entered, but I saw his hand tighten on the arm of his chair. "The rose," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards. "She took the boy." "She took him because of me," I said, stepping into the cold light. My voice didn't shake. The grief had been burned out of me, replaced by a crystalline, jagged clarity. "Tell me what I have to do to get him back." Min-Tae turned then, his eyes raking over my torn uniform and the dark circles under my eyes. "You want to be a soldier? You don't have the stomach for it, little bird. You've spent your life clearing plates, not clearing rooms." "You're wrong," I countered, moving closer until I could see the reflection of the monitors in his obsidian eyes. I pointed to a screen showing a high-stakes poker game in a private club downtown. "That man in the gray suit, the one with the gold watch. He's about to fold. He's been tugging at his left cuff for 10 minutes every time he gets a low hand. And the woman 2 seats down? She's the one running the table. She isn't looking at her cards. She's watching the reflection in the dealer's glasses." Min-Tae stilled. He looked at the screen, then back at me, his expression shifting from dismissal to a dangerous, burgeoning curiosity. "I was a waitress at the Gilded Lotus," I continued, my voice steady. "I spent 10 hours a day becoming an expert in the things people try to hide. I know when a husband is lying to his wife by the way he touches his wedding band. I know when a deal is going south because the air in the room changes. I've been invisible my whole life, Mr. Seo. And when you're invisible, you see everything." A slow, predatory smile spread across Min-Tae's face. He stood up, towering over me, the scent of expensive tobacco and cold steel clinging to him. "You've spent years reading the appetites of the wealthy. Now, you'll learn to read their weaknesses." He walked to a table and picked up a sleek, compact firearm, weighing it in his hand before holding it out to me. "A soldier follows orders. A watcher controls the game. Rosa thinks she took a pawn, Kemi. She doesn't realize she's just handed me a queen." He didn't give me the gun, not yet. Instead, he pointed to a dossier on a screen. That is the Costa family's lead strategist. Tell me everything you see in his posture. If you're going to save your brother, your promotion begins now. The transition happened in a room of cold glass and mirrors, a stark contrast to the cramped staff locker room where I had pinned my name tag for years. The black and white polyester of the Gilded Lotus was gone, replaced by silk so heavy and dark it looked like liquid midnight. It wasn't just a dress, it was armor. As the stylist adjusted the high, structured collar, designed to hide the microtransmitter pressed against my skin, I realized I was merely swapping one uniform for another. High society isn't a party, Kemi. Min-Tae's voice drifted from the doorway. He was already dressed in a tuxedo that made him look like a lethal shadow. It is a theater of war. Every smile is a tactical maneuver. Every toast is a potential execution. I stared at my reflection. The girl who had worried about rent and overcooked appetizers was buried beneath layers of couture. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe bun, and my makeup was a masterclass in aggressive elegance. Eyes sharpened with obsidian liner, lips stained the color of dried blood. I looked like the kind of woman who ordered hits, not the one who overheard them. The stakes are higher, I said, my voice sounding foreign in the hollow space of the dressing room. But the floor plan is the same. People still want to be seen. They still want to be fed. Only tonight, they're hungry for power. Min-Tae walked toward me, the heavy thud of his boots the only sound in the room. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of earrings, tiers of black diamond that caught the light with a cold, jagged shimmer. As he leaned in to clip them to my ears, his fingers grazed the side of my neck. A brief heat that made my pulse jump. You'll be seated at the host's table, he whispered. Rosa will be there. She'll expect you to be terrified. She'll expect you to be the girl from the pantry. Use that. Let her think you are still the prey until the moment you close the trap. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the hidden blade strapped to my thigh. I had spent years navigating the Gilded Lotus, by reading the subtle shifts in the air, the way a guest's posture changed before they complained, or the flicker of annoyance in a supervisor's eye. Tonight, I would be reading the tilt of a head during a betrayal, and the tightening of a hand around a flute of poisoned champagne. High society was just another dining room, and I was finally ready to stop serving and start playing the game. I stepped away from the mirror, the silk of my new uniform whispering against my skin like a threat. The waitress was dead. The queen was ready for her debut. The car ride toward the abandoned cathedral was silent, save for the low hum of the tires against the pavement. Min-Tae sat beside me, his profile silhouetted against the passing city lights, his hand resting near mine but not touching. The aggressive air he usually wore like a second skin had softened into something heavier, something that tasted like old grief. You called me unaware back at the restaurant, he said suddenly, his voice a low gravel that barely rose above the car's engine. You thought I was blind to Rosa's betrayal. I looked at him, my own reflection in the window ghosting over his sharp features. You were distracted. Even a king can't see a blade if his mind is elsewhere. He turned his head slowly, his obsidian eyes unreadable. It was the anniversary. Not of a victory, but of a silence. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out a small, worn photograph, the edges frayed from years of touch. In it, a younger Min-Tae stood beside a woman who shared his gaze, but held a softness he had long since purged. My sister. She was the only part of this life that was clean. 5 years ago, they used her to get to me. They made me watch the light leave her eyes because I was too busy looking at the throne to look at her. The air in the armored SUV felt thin. I saw the tremor he tried to hide in his fingers, the small fracture in the marble statue. He wasn't unaware because of arrogance. He was unaware because he was haunted. I was mourning a ghost while a living demon sat at my table, he continued, tucking the photo away. I had accepted my own death long before you leaned down to whisper. I thought it was my penance. I reached out then, my fingers grazing the dark ink on his hand. This time he didn't pull away. He turned his palm up, lacing his fingers with mine. A grip that felt less like a master and more like a man holding onto a lifeline. I didn't save a ghost, I said firmly, meeting his stare. I saved a man. And that man is going to help me save my brother. Min-Tae leaned in, his forehead coming to rest against mine. The scent of wood smoke and steel was overwhelming, a grounding force in the storm of my life. A dragon does not forget a debt, Kemi. You gave me back a life I had already discarded. In return, I will give you the world, or I will burn it down to find your brother. In that quiet, darkened space, the bond between us solidified. No longer just a tactical alliance, but something forged in shared trauma and a mutual refusal to be invisible any longer. We weren't just a boss and his protege. We were two survivors, sharpening our teeth for the same kill. The abandoned cathedral breathed with a cold, hollow air that even the warmth of 1,000 candles couldn't mask. Reimagined as a gala venue, the space was a labyrinth of Gothic arches, velvet-draped alcoves, and high society predators. To anyone else, it was a display of opulence. To me, it was a giant dining room with a complex floor plan and 1,000 blind spots. I stepped out of the shadow of a marble pillar, my silk gown flowing like liquid ink, and felt the familiar weight of the invisible girl mantle settle over me. Position, I whispered into the microtransmitter hidden against my collarbone. I see you, Min-Tae's voice crackled in my ear, distant and grounding. Don't rush. You're a ghost, Kemi. Let them look right through you. I moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of a server, keeping my eyes downcast just enough to appear submissive while my periphery mapped the room. I wasn't looking at the faces. I was looking at the service staff, identifying the rhythm of the tray carriers and the rotations of the security guards. I knew exactly when a waiter would turn his back to refill a glass, and I used that second to slip a small, adhesive listening device onto the underside of a heavy mahogany buffet table. The art of the watcher was my greatest weapon. I navigated the room by reading the social currents. The way the crowd parted for a high-ranking syndicate member, the subtle shift in a guard's stance when he grew bored. I was the girl who cleared the plates, the girl who filled the water, the girl who didn't exist. Near the altar, where the most powerful players were gathered, I saw Rosa. She was a vision in gold, laughing at a joke made by a man whose hands were stained with more than just wine. She looked triumphant, her eyes scanning the room for Min-Tae, never once pausing on the woman in the black silk dress standing 3 feet away. I leaned against a stone column, appearing to check my earring, and deftly pressed the final bug into a decorative crevice in the masonry. My heart was a drum in my chest, but my hands remained steady. I had spent years being ignored by people like this, and tonight, their arrogance was the key to their undoing. As I turned to slip back into the shadows, I saw the exit leading to the vestry. That was where Tund would be. The bugs were live, the layout was mapped, and the invisible girl was finally ready to make herself seen. I drifted past a security detail, my movements so synchronized with the flow of the room that I was nothing more than a flicker of shadow against the candlelight. The infiltration was complete. Now the real war began. The vestry was a cold, stone-walled cage, hidden away from the glittering masks and hollow laughter of the gala. I stepped through the heavy oak door, my silk gown rustling like a warning against the flagstone floor. In the center of the room, Tund sat bound to a high-backed chair, his eyes wide with a terror that shattered whatever remained of my restraint. Beside him stood Rosa, the gold of her dress reflecting the flicker of a single iron wall sconce. She held a pistol to his temple, her expression no longer that of a socialite, but of a woman who had lost her empire and was determined to burn everything else down with her. One step more and the boy becomes a memory, Rosa said, her voice sharp and brittle. Where is he, Kemi? Where is your king? I stopped, my hands raised in a gesture of surrender that hid the lethal intent coursing through my veins. He's coming for you, Rosa. But he isn't the one you should be looking for. Rosa laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. You're a waitress. A mistake. A glitch in a plan that should have been perfect. You think because you put on a dress and some diamonds that you're part of this world? You're still just the help. I moved closer, ignoring the tremor in her hand as the gun barrel pressed harder against Tun's skin. I needed to get into her space. I needed to use the only weapon I had left, the invisibility she still believed in. I leaned in, mimicking the submissive tilt of a server, and let my voice drop to that terrifying, intimate low. I am the help, I whispered, my lips inches from her ear as she recoiled from the sheer intensity of my gaze. And as the help, I've been listening to your men on the comms for the last hour. I heard them surrender 3 minutes ago. I heard Min-Tae tell them to leave you to me. You're already dead, Rosa. You're just the last one to know it. The lie was a masterpiece, delivered with the absolute certainty of a woman who had spent years reading every crack in a person's confidence. Rosa's eyes widened, her pupils blooming with a sudden, paralyzing doubt. In that second of hesitation, that dangerous whisper, that turned her world into a house of cards, the gun drifted just an inch away from Tund. It was the only window Seo Min-Tae needed. The stained glass window above the altar shattered as a single, suppressed round whistled through the air. The bullet didn't hit Rosa. It hit the stone wall an inch from her head, a terrifying exclamation point to my threat. Rosa screamed, spinning toward the sound, and I lunged. I tackled her, my weight driving her away from my brother, as the vestry door was kicked open. Min-Tae burst into the room, his silhouette a towering shadow of vengeance. He didn't fire again. He didn't have to. The terror I had planted with a whisper had done the work. Rosa fell back against the stone, her weapon clattering to the floor. Her power evaporated. I didn't look at her. I reached for Tund, pulling him into my arms, the silk of my gown finally stained with the tears of a survivor. The invisible girl had spoken, and the empire had fallen. The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and steel, suspended so high above the Thames that the roar of London was reduced to a distant rhythmic hum. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the hem of my silk robe pooling around my feet like a shadow. Outside, a winter fog had swallowed the city, turning the Shard and the distant lights of the West End into ghost-pale embers. A year ago, I was a girl who looked at these buildings from the pavement, calculating how many shifts it would take to pay for a life I could never touch. Now, I owned the horizon. A soft chime echoed through the room. The sound of the private elevator. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I simply watched the reflection in the glass as a young man in a crisp white uniform entered the room, carrying a silver tray. He moved with the same practiced, invisible grace I once perfected, his eyes downcast, his presence a whisper. He set a crystal glass of Malbec on the obsidian side table, and retreated without a sound. I was the one being served now. I was the one people feared to look at too closely. You're brooding again. A low, gravelly voice vibrated through the air. Seo Min-Tae stepped into the light, his presence as heavy and commanding as the day he sat at table 4. He wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, his chin resting on my shoulder. The scent of wood smoke and expensive tobacco, the scent of my sanctuary, enveloped me. He pressed a hand against my stomach, his tattooed fingers splaying over the silk.
I was thinking about the Gilded Lotus, I admitted, leaning back into his heat. About the girl who thought a wine list was the heaviest thing she'd ever have to carry. That girl died in the vestry, Min-Tae whispered, his lips grazing the column of my neck. The woman who replaced her is the only reason I'm still breathing. The only reason this empire didn't crumble into the river. Over the last 12 months, we had dismantled the Costa influence and purged the rot Rosa had left behind. Tund was safe, studying at a university protected by guards who answered only to me. We were moving the business into the light, legitimizing the docks, trading the street wars for boardrooms. It was a slower kind of violence, but we were winning. I turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had started as a dangerous stranger and become the anchor of my world. I reached up, my fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "You made me a queen, Min-Tae," I said softly. "No," he countered, his obsidian eyes burning with a fierce, quiet pride. "You made yourself visible. I just gave you the throne to stand on." He kissed me then, a slow, possessive seal on our shared sovereignty. Outside, the fog continued to roll in, hiding the scars of the city and the blood we'd shed to stay on top. Underneath the elegance, the empire remained, brutal, beautiful, and ours. I was no longer the girl in the background. I was the one who saw everything, and together, we ruled the shadows. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Your support is the reason I can keep bringing these stories of betrayal, justice, and transformation to life. If you enjoyed this journey from the lilies to the light, please hit that like button, subscribe to join our community, and let me know in the comments. I will be there waiting for you guys.